Welcome to the Musicians Weekly Volume 30. I've been asked several times which treaty of orchestration I would advise to study. And of course, there are several interesting treatises on orchestration. And it depends on what you are most interested in. So if you're interested in investigating into the orchestra of the time of Wagner and Liszt and Berlioz and the Romantics, it's absolutely useful to study Hector Berlioz. And then best the original Berlioz. Later there has been the edition by Richard Strauss, which is of course then for Strauss time, the thing you take. And if you study the Berlioz or the Berlioz-Strauss, there is a fantastic addendum to the Berlioz treatise by Charles-Marie Widor, which is exactly how the author himself describes his study on orchestration. But I would advise, for a more universal idea about orchestration, to study first and also in a way last the Principles of Orchestration by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. This is the most basic and universal book about the traditional orchestra. And there are also these fantastic laws, like one trumpet or trombone is as strong as two horns, is as strong as four woodwinds, are as strong as 8 string instruments. And these things, and this is very simple, all these things described in the Rimsky-Korsakov treatise are extremely simple and extremely pragmatic and practical. And so the Rimsky-Korsakov is the basics for everybody, for every amateur also, to understand the relations between the instruments in the orchestra, to understand the things you have to know about the orchestra if you want to do something with it, if you want to orchestrate a piece, if you want to understand why an orchestration works or doesn't work, all these questions. And if in all the classical and romantic works and also early modern works, it is the thing you have to study and you have to know. And then there are things you can add to that. There is a fantastic treatise on orchestration, but only in German, by Egon Wellesz from his earlier years before he emigrated to the UK. Wellesz's book is very personal and is definitely a book only describing things he himself observed and collected. And it is in 2 small volumes. It's not a book to start with, basically, but it's a book very helpful to have some side aspects from the Rimsky-Korsakov. I mean, Rimsky-Korsakov, we have to understand, he was not only a phenomenal orchestrator, he was a phenomenal teacher as well. And not only for Igor Stravinsky and Nikolai Cherepnin and Alexander Glazunov and his son-in-law Maximilian Steinberg, who were also fantastic orchestrators, but also for people who came to Russia to study, like Ottorino Respighi. So he was the master. And this much more than Berlioz. Berlioz was the pioneer, and Rimsky-Korsakov was the master. And of course, he cared also for all the music by Borodin and by Mussorgsky. And so everybody went there and got his advice, and he was conducting also himself. And he was a professional conductor and had a lot of experience with his orchestra in St. Petersburg. Wellesz was a fantastic young composer. He was one of the best symphonists in history in the 20th century. And his works are very well orchestrated. And he studied with Schoenberg. He studied Schoenberg's technique, but he decided to stay a tonal, or let's say, free tonal composer. Then we come to the book for the orchestration in the 20th century. Like the kind of successor to Rimsky-Korsakov. And this is the treatise by Alfredo Casella, but posthumously published and also done in collaboration with and published by Virgilio Mortari. And this book is the definite pragmatic book about orchestration. I know many composers from the older generation and some youngers, and I got to know many who used this book as the only book they use. Because everything you basically need to know is there, but in a more modern manner. So it is also called the technique of the modern orchestra. And this book contains all the things, also the lowest note to the highest note, of course. And there you can see it changed between Rimsky-Korsakov's time and Casella's time. But of course, we have to know about all these treatises. Some instruments have developed considerably since these treatises were written. And so also after Casella, when you look for what he writes about the double bassoon, for example, it is not anymore the same. We have such fantastic double bassoon players today. And these limits, particularly sound-wise that are given, or also unclear intonation in the low register and very mellow sound and all these things, these have changed in a dramatic way towards a better reality. And so this is, of course, still not the end where we are now. But now it is a little bit like in sports, in Formula One. I mean, if in 1967 Jim Clark took, I don't know if I forgot, half a minute from all the other competitors on the Nürburgring, today we have such small difference of 0.001 seconds or something like that between first and second driver normally. And so we have the same in the competition of playing the instrument technically the most advanced. And we have very interesting things going on thanks to composers like, particularly, for example, Kalevi, who is a composer who writes for all the instruments solo pieces and orchestra, concertos with orchestra. So he wrote also concerto for theremin. He wrote a concerto for, of course, for double bassoon, for bass clarinet, and for all the instruments the orchestra offers. And he always goes to the most extreme in the technical demands. And you may like that or not. It is very interesting music, always very original, always very musical. And it shows us what is possible now when you want to orchestrate for a particular instrument. When he wrote his Fifth Symphony, it was so difficult that every instrument was treated like an advanced soloist on the forefront of international competition. So the symphony was considered unplayable, but more and more it becomes, even this music becomes playable. And of course, with his solo concertos, he challenges the players in the utmost manner. So if you want to study how you can treat single instruments, which I would call, it's not orchestration, it is instrumentation, you have to study the scores of Kalevi. That is the most secure way. Of course, you can also study the scores of other composers of our time, But in Aho's case, I know exactly that he always tries to get out of the instrument, from the virtuosic side, the utmost that is possible. So that is very, very helpful. So you can have this Casella Mortari book, and then you have a lot of Aho scores, and you look through them. But then there is one treatise of orchestration, which I have to say is the best of them all. Of course, not, it is written some time ago, so it was written in, basically it was put together in the first half of the 20th century. This is the Traité de l'Orchestration. It's only available in French, by Charles Koechlin. And this is in 4 large, thick volumes. And it is a lot of French music, particularly inside them, but also, of course, other music. And there is a lot of Koechlin music among the examples. Like in Rimsky-Korsakov, there is a lot of Rimsky-Korsakov, of course. So, but in Koechlin's case, of course, almost nobody knows the music. So these examples are, today they are more instructive, you could think, than they were before, because Koechlin's orchestral oeuvre is now almost completely recorded. Not totally completely, but it will probably happen within the next few years, as the symphonies are now on their way. And so you can, of course, listen to the music, but as we have to know from a recording, we don't have the realistic impression how the balance in an orchestra works and how all these things work together. So we can get an idea about the piece, but we cannot get an idea about the real relationships. And therefore, the weak point with the Koechlin, we could say, is that there are so many Koechlin Koechlin examples. Of course, there is also a lot of Delibes and Massenet and Lalo and Bizet and Saint-Saëns and all these things. So it's French. And a lot of modern music. There's a lot of the time. There's, of course, Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel, and all these things are included. But Koechlin goes deep into the principles as well as into the details of any instrument and of all the combinations. And so if you really want to be an advanced connoisseur of orchestration, you go through the whole Koechlin. It will take some time. If you are a composer and you wish to be a composer with all these subtleties and all these fantastic, unusual combinations, and for example, when you listen to these phenomenal works by Jean-Louis Florence or some other composers of our time who are really great people working with the orchestra, and you want to be one of them, you have the highest ideals about it, then there is no way to pass by the Koechlin Traité de l'Orchestration. This is the opus ultimum in orchestration. So that is my contribution. Of course, there are then some newer, some more recent orchestration treatises who try to also give an idea about how avant-garde music works. But I would advise that in this case, you take some percussion treatise. Peinkofer and Tannigel in German is fantastic, but there are definitely some others. And study scores. And go on some festivals and listen to these pieces and get some ideas about. Of course, there is also a lot to be said about notation, about unusual use of the instruments, unnatural use, unidiomatic use of instruments. This is something completely different. And I am sure it would be better if you don't study too much of these contemporary things and invent your own things. There is a lot of unidiomatic things that can be still invented. But the most important thing is that, first of all, you should know exactly what are the idiomatic use, what is the idiomatic use of the instruments, what really works in a sonorically most effective way. And then you can look for other solutions. But it's always best, like Stravinsky, if you are really able to do all the things, you have fantastic craft, and then you try to do some very unusual things. So problem with composers today is very often that they are very used to do unusual things, but they don't really know how to do the traditional and idiomatic things on the instruments. So that would be very important. But of course, you can study these school books, we could say, which is absolutely perfect, like Walter Piston, Treatises in Orchestration. And these are very useful. And there are also some historical treatises by Cecil Forsyth, for example, and many others that are absolutely not bad. But if you want to have really a kind of best solutions, in short, principles, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, Principles of Orchestration. In short, pragmatic, 20th century, The Technique of the Modern Orchestra by Casella and Mortari. And as an encyclopedia of all these fantastic facets and details and delicacies and subtleties, the book of the books, Koechlin, Traité de l'Orchestration. So far, I hope this was helpful, and if it is helpful for you, it would be very welcome if you subscribe to this channel and could spread all these considerations, these basic considerations about phenomenology of music and about some important musical basics. Wish you well and see you soon again. Bye.